volunteer at Crossfire where I volunteer.
Oh.
Nice. Okay, so cosmological argument is categorized, I think, in what people would call offensive apologetics. So there's two categories of apologetics. There's offensive and defensive, or if you prefer, positive and negative. So the cosmological argument would be a positive argument or positive apologetic because it's in support of the existence of God. It's not defending against an attack against God's existence. So if somebody says, well, God couldn't exist because the problem of evil, for example, that would be a form of negative apologetics. So
when you answer the question, you mean of why God, what was that again?
Would exist.
Would exist. So you would say, so that would be a response to a negative.
Mm-hmm. So the cosmological argument is a positive apologetic because it's in support of the assertion that God exists.
Okay.
So I guess I'm just starting off with that because I think it's interesting that the book is titled Evidence for God, when not necessarily all of the arguments are evidence. They're not necessarily all positive apologetics. Some of them are negative. They're like in defense against attacks, asserting that God exists or doesn't exist.
So most of these in this book are going to be positive?
I think so. I mean, if just looking at the topics and the titles, it seems that some of them are more on the defensive versus the offensive side. But
and positive is more defensive?
No, positive would be more assertive.
Assertive.
Mm-hmm. So like the cosmological argument in this case is asserting that the origin of the universe provides positive evidence for the existence of God.
Okay.
Well, and it can. So in this chapter, it says that although their specific argument doesn't necessarily directly say that God is the cause of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a cause of everything. It could be God.
The unseen cause or something like that, or the
the
uncaused cause.
Uncaused cause,
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's why it's evidence, because a single piece of evidence by itself doesn't do much. You have to gather different, just like in a court case, you're gathering evidence to make your claim or to make your ruling or make a decision about, okay, well, is this true or not true?
Well, I remember they said they had an analogy about a train and what caused the first car to start, that the second and third one would be pulling the first one, but what started the first one?
Yep.
See, I did read it.
Yeah.
So what's the second premise?
Morning.
Good morning.
The vendors?
Good morning. It's Debbie.
I know you from something.
I'm Chuck from Crossfire.
Oh, that's
Volunteer.
right. That's right. I was going to say, I knew you. You were out of context.
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't say welcome.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I was spoiled. I used to have a 10 o'clock service instead of 9 o'clock.
No worries. No worries. I'm Randy.
I'm Chuck.
I'm John.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Is that the textbook?
It is, yeah. Yeah, so this week we're going over the first chapter. And we're not going to go in order. We're going to go, what you guys end up picking.
Yeah, picking and choosing.
The first one's the cosmological argument.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you had a chance to go over it on the website. John put
Oh, yeah, I thought this was the first day for this class.
It is.
Oh, okay.
It is. So, you didn't have to read it. He put it there in case you wanted to.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to go over right now.
Oh, good. Yeah.
The premise is there's
I've read some apologetics already, but I need a refresher.
Yes, that's what I was saying.
Do they have tests in this class?
No.
Unless you really want them, but no.
No.
This is just to be fun and grow in your knowledge. So somebody asks you why you believe what you believe, you have a good answer.
Say that again.
So you'll have a good answer.
Yes, yeah.
Not just,
Be
oh, I
ready
grew
to
up in
have-
the church.
Yeah.
No, I just grew up in the church. That's what they told me to believe.
Yeah, we just believe it because we believe it. We don't have any reasons.
Yeah.
Well, here's a God thing that'll say something. This happened to me the other day at Crossfire. I'm in charge of all the Bibles, among other things. And people will come to me and ask me for specific Bibles, which we may or may not have. It's what I buy and what gets donated. And Kathy, Kathy Gillespie. All right, she came to me and asked for a Bible for an 18-year-old that had just turned 18-year-old, became a Christian. Her parents don't let her go to church, but she can go to youth group.
Oh.
So I had a teen boys, but no teen girls. Looked and looked, had no teen girls. So I was going to buy one. And so I went to eBay and I found a couple and I asked Kathy which one. She goes, oh, don't buy it. Don't buy it. I'll have her parents buy it. Don't worry. And then she said, God will provide. God will provide the book. It will come in. So I said, okay, I knew I didn't have it. And in my office, I get so much stuff, and I lifted up one box off the top of another one, and right there, this was like a minute after Kathy said it, was a beautiful teen girl's Bible.
That's cool.
That gave
That's
me,
cool.
in fact, it still does give me
Yeah.
chills.
Yeah.
Now if that was not an answer from God, I mean, truly, I believe that. That was a miracle, because I did not have one.
Yeah.
I have some books too that might be helpful for her. That I have duplicates of some in my library that I'm planning on giving to Crossfire, but also that would be a good specific.
Well, Kathy's not here this week. She's with her daughters, but next week you can mention that to her and see what she thinks about it.
Oh, okay, yeah. That I better write her name down
Right, so a little bit of brief review from On Guard, actually. So when we first started this class, we reviewed a book called On Guard. And if you're watching online, I'll put it up here. So what I've written on the board is known as a syllogism. In apologetics, or in debate, I suppose, in general, when you're making a case using propositional logic, oftentimes you'll use what is known as a syllogism. So a syllogism is a series of premises that lead to a conclusion. So our first argument, the cosmological argument, uses the following syllogism. The first premise, what we observe is contingent. So everything in the universe is contingent, meaning that it doesn't have to exist, but the fact that it does exist owes its existence to something that caused it to exist, right? Like we don't just see, root beer and Beethoven and bicycles just pop into existence. Like something causes things to exist, right? So when you're making an argument with a syllogism, the premises should be more likely true than not. So a good argument has premises that are more likely true than not. So do you think what we observe in our universe is contingent? Everything in our universe is contingent. Is that a good premise?
Now, when you say contingent,
Contingent meaning it owes its existence to something else. Like it might not have existed, but it does exist because something else caused it to exist. So there's two kinds of things. There's contingent things,
okay,
and then there's necessary things. Some people would say that abstract objects like numbers and sets exist necessarily. Personally, I would say that I'm a non-realist. I would argue that numbers and sets don't really exist, that they're imaginary. The only thing that exists necessarily, meaning it exists uncaused, it exists by necessity of its own nature. It has to exist. It couldn't not exist. That sounds like it only describes one thing, right?
I'm not sure.
Well, what can you think of that has to exist? If it didn't exist, nothing else would.
Well, God.
Yep, exactly. God is the only necessarily existing thing. Everything else is contingent because everything comes from God. Right? So the first premise in the cosmological argument is that everything in our universe is contingent, meaning that it owes its existence to something else.
What's that? There's a saying about every cause has to have, or every thing in existence has to have a cause.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not true about God.
Right.
So how does that statement go? Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about, actually.
Yeah, that's what the same thing as the contingency.
Mm-hmm.
How does that saying go, though?
I'm not exactly sure specifically the same, but everything has a cause all the way back to the uncaused cause, which is God, describes God.
Yeah.
The uncaused cause describes God.
Okay.
So if everything has a cause, then the universe can't just be an infinite loop, could it? Like that's an absurdity. That doesn't make sense. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So the first premise is what we observe in our universe is contingent, right? So we can't think of anything that exists necessarily, like it exists by nature of its own necessity. It must exist. Like I said, some people would argue that abstract objects, numbers and sets and things like that exist in that nature, but that's a whole other debate. The second premise is a network of causally dependent things cannot be infinite. So if everything in the universe is causally dependent, meaning that it requires something else in order for it to exist. Like, I wouldn't exist without my mom and dad. My dad wouldn't exist without his mom and dad. His dad wouldn't exist without his mom and dad, right? So, like, we can't ever get to a point where it's like, well, his dad is just always there, right? Like, everybody has a mom and dad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you agree with that second premise? A network of causally dependent things meaning, you have to have a mom and dad in order to exist. A network of causally dependent things cannot be infinite, meaning you can't have an infinite sequence of parents and children. Like, you can't just go back forever. Like, you will eventually run out of parents, right? So then the third premise is actually just a restatement of the second premise. It just sounds like, you're repeating yourself. A network of causally dependent things must be finite, because if it can't be infinite, then it must be finite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then the conclusion is that there must be a first cause in a finite network of contingent things. So if you go back, if I go back to my dad and my dad goes back to his dad and his dad goes back to his dad, there must be a first cause of all things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the cosmological argument is, but it doesn't just apply to parents and children, it applies to planets and stars and galaxies and trees and animals and rocks and everything.
Of life.
Yeah.
Now, when you use all of these kind of terms, practically speaking, how many ordinary people that you run into will you?
You might be surprised. I mean, there are some people who they've done their research, they've read up on their stuff, and they'll come at you and be like, well, just because the universe isn't finite and it has a beginning, because a lot of atheists will agree with you that the universe has a beginning. We call it the Big Bang, which I would say the Big Bang is when God said, "Let there be light."
Mm-hmm.
Bang. But anyway, you might be surprised, but there are quite a few people you might run into who know their stuff.
College graduates and that kind of thing, and the atheists in particular probably go into all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But by ordinary people, I mean, well, I guess you answered that with there's more than you think there would be.
Yeah, I mean, you might be surprised. You might not necessarily come across the cosmological argument. You might not necessarily come across someone who would be prepared to refute this.
Yeah.
But like I said, this is more of an offensive or positive apologetic, and so this could be used to sort of put a rock in someone's shoe, if you will,
Right.
when you're witnessing to people and you're talking to them about, if somebody says, well, I don't think there's a God, and you say, well, what makes you say that? Well, there's just not enough evidence. Is that what you think?
Yeah.
Let me tell you about the cosmological argument.
Well, and I think a lot of people, will be a lot of people that aren't familiar with the different terms and whatnot. There will be some that are. Like I was surprised the other day, I had a conversation with an unbeliever for hours, and he was very well learned. But there's a lot of people I know that don't. And I have these conversations with them. Their friends are like, right over their head.
Yeah, right.
So we also have to be able to relay or talk without big terms for the people who don't know them, and be able to discern and have the judgment like, well, this person I can tell might not understand these, I'll use a different term or what that is. And that's why I like this book. And it says in the end of the first chapter is that first, this is of course a very brief and oversimplified discussion of an argument with a long and diverse history. It talks about it. So this is I don't know if I'd call it layman's version, kind of. Well, yeah.
Yeah, that's,
Compared, there's other books that will take this topic and it'll be like.
yeah, I've got the one that, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That's a real,
Yeah.
Is it?
good size.
I've heard of that one, but I haven't seen it physical.
Yeah,
I've only seen the
it's-
cover
It's
online.
excellent too. I mean, there's a lot of good material out there that is really.
But usually, if you're talking to someone who, if someone will talk to you about it, usually they'll have somewhat of a background, and if not, then you
And then
don't go straight into the deep end. You talk about other stuff and ask them maybe about what they believe.
Right, yeah.
Why do they believe what they believe?
Mhm.
So a lot of times they don't get asked that question.
Right.
Like, oh well, yeah, I've never been asked that.
Yeah.
Well, let me think about it, and they may not be able to answer it, so they'll go back and do their own research on what they believe, and go might see the shortfall or shortcoming or the gap that's missing there, and go, oh, they'll start sparking other things. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Yeah, that, I think that's good to ask them questions about where they're coming from and why they believe what they believe, and then find out. And then you had know more how to approach
yes,
talking to what, and so yeah, it's good to know all these things too, but to have the answers that you might run into. And so that's combination.
mm-hmm.
Can I step back when you talk about the Big Bang? Doesn't that relate to an uncaused cause? Because if the Big Bang exists, where did all the material, the matter, come from when this Big Bang in theory happened? I mean, is that a good way to refute that?
I think so. So that's actually an interesting point. I'll try not to get too technical, but there are scientists, namely Lawrence Krauss, who argue that quantum mechanics, virtual particles in the vacuum, it's so unstable that matter will just pop into existence uncaused. These are literally arguments that this guy, and other scientists like him will argue. But the problem with that is that when you start arguing that, these physical particles come from, the vacuum, they're not talking about nothing. What you and I consider nothing is literally not anything.
Yeah.
What Lawrence Krauss is talking about as nothing has physical structure. It's a sea of gravitational chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, what you're looking at is like the old Abbott and Costello. Who's on first?
Mm-hmm.
What's on second? Or the Cyclops in Homer's the Odyssey, I think, where or have you read it, where the Cyclops is like, what's your name? And Odysseus says, nobody. Oh, that's kind of a funny name. And then later Odysseus pokes his eye and he's like, oh, and he runs off to his Cyclops friends, and his Cyclops friends are like, who did this to you? And he says, nobody did this to me. It's a joke, right? Because like when you say nobody did this to me, the understanding is that no one, like literally no one, did this. So that's essentially what Lawrence Krauss is doing when he's saying, oh yeah, virtual particles come into existence uncaused all the time from the vacuum. That's not technically nothing. That's kind of an abuse of scientific terms.
Yeah, language is
He's playing with your he's playing with misunderstandings of what nothing, like when a layperson says nothing, they mean literally not anything, not even empty space.
No vacuum.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same as spontaneous regeneration? Or?
Yeah, that's another thing. Like the scientific community is actually pretty dogmatic about is spontaneous generation. Things physically cannot just pop into existence without a cause.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. They'll say that and they'll believe that, but then if we tell them, well, God just is. He's always been. That's outside the realm of possibility. But what they believe is just as,
Yeah,
That life came from non-life items.
Mm-hmm.
Did my analogy with the parents, like children have parents who have parents who have parents who have parents, did that kind of help? I tried to sort of reformulate the boxcar analogy, because he talks about linking boxcars and all the boxcars are moving. But even if you were to like loop them all the way around the earth and hook them up, and they're moving still, like how? How does that make sense?
Yeah, that was good, because that brings you back to where it has to have a finite start. It can't be infinite.
Right, exactly.
So in this chapter they talk about causes. So everything that you can see and observe has a cause.
Yeah.
And that cause has a cause, and that cause has a cause.
Right.
And so they use one example that secular scientists and atheists will use is like a boxcar train, for example.
Right.
Car A is being pulled by B.
Yeah,
B is
here
being
it is.
pulled by C.
He says, imagine you're seeing for the first time a train moving past you. Baffled, you wonder what is causing the boxcar in front of you to move. You come to realize that it's being pulled by another boxcar in front of it, and so on down the tracks beyond your view. This picture allows us to visualize the various atheistic scenarios so commonly heard in our society that attempt to describe how it is that things exist in our universe. Well, the cosmos is just a great circle of life, we're told, but if we're to connect the boxcars all the way around the universe in a big circle until the last one hooks up to the first one, that still won't explain how they're moving, let alone any of the others. If contingent things cause each other to exist in a circle, there is still nothing to initiate the causal process. The atheist offers perhaps a more promising scenario. Well, the cosmos is an intricately evolved ecosystem in which everything is related causally to everything else. So boxcars clutter the universe in an unimaginably complex system of railroading such that in some way every boxcar is coupled to every other one, and therefore every boxcar is pulling the first one. Still, we have no account for the motion of the first boxcar. Likewise, the notion of an evolving ecosystem does not account for the existence of any actual thing in our universe. So,
Playing devil's advocate with that, if it's that when they say it's around the whole circle, it's the force of gravity that they're going downhill. So, so you need to be ready to answer that. There's a lot of, so I don't know if I would use that analogy just because of that idea that, okay, some of them are going to be going downhill, that'll pull the ones that are coming behind. So,
But where did gravity come from? Gravity didn't exist in a vacuum.
right. You have to appeal to something else.
Yeah. Yep.
So in the beginning of this article, the author, David Beck, says that the cosmological argument actually refers to a whole cluster of arguments or patterns of thinking. One such argument that I particularly like for its elegance and simplicity is William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. And that one is so easy that you can memorize it. Like, it's so easy.
Yeah, I like the easy ones.
So the way his goes is everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first premise.
Yeah.
Premise one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause.
What was the second one?
The universe began to exist. So then, like I said, with syllogisms and premises, you have to identify where are people going to challenge you. Are they going to challenge you that, oh, the universe didn't begin to exist? There's a lot of evidence that shows that the universe began to exist at some time in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that begins has a cause. Is that the first?
So then, when people say, well, what about God? Doesn't God need a cause? Well, you missed the first premise. The first premise was everything that begins to exist has a cause.
That's a hard one to comprehend, even as a Christian, that God has always existed, that God did not have a beginning. That's a hard one to wrap your mind around.
Yes.
It really is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and a good one, so the Truth Project, Del Tackett talks about it being, he uses a box as an example. So the box represents the universe and everything inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
If God created...
Corey did that in the Bridging the Gap, remember?
Did he?
Yeah, he had a cardboard box. And
Oh, he did.
it was
That's
pretty
right,
cool.
yeah. That's a good
Sorry.
example.
Yeah.
Go ahead and remind me, because I was at that
Yeah, so
talk.
so the box represents the universe and everything in the universe. Right? When God created everything in the box, is he limited by what's in the box? And there's time, space, and matter in the box.
Mm-hmm.
You have the universe, space, matter, the planets, us, plants, everything. So you have time and then time. For us, time runs linear. That doesn't mean it runs linear for God, but so all of that's in the box.
Okay.
If God created that, is he limited by that?
No.
No.
Why?
So yeah.
He's outside of the box because he
Exactly.
created it.
Yeah,
so he's
exactly.
not limited by
Right.
time, space, and matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the time part, I think, is real critical because you have these causalities that they're talking about in this chapter, that this created that, and that created that, up into the very beginning, or the Big Bang. But what created that? Well, that's all in the box. God's outside the box.
One of the current things that I'm running into that I'd like to toss out is this idea of outer beings from outer space. And I listened to 740 AM. He really believes that there's other planets or not. But so anyway, the idea that they're the ones that created everything. So, but I don't believe there is beings outside of the earth because Christ came to earth to die here. I don't think he repeated that in other planets or anything. So what do you think about the idea of these other beings? Do you think they're real, or do you think there's like satanic deception and just because there's a whole lot of people. I listen to a lot of radio all night long, and they're all into that stuff. There's one program that they're constantly.
That's definitely a hot topic right now.
Yeah.
It's can be inconsistent with the Bible because if God created Adam and Eve, well, he doesn't make any mention of aliens, and if they're advanced species have been around for thousands of years.
Yeah, that's a good, simple, and a good answer.
Then that would make the creation story, right? If we evolved and didn't, it's inconsistent, and that's a whole nother topic to get into.
Now, why would it be inconsistent? Because I've never really thought it through, but I don't have a bias one way or another because, all right, God created Adam and Eve. That is our world. That is our story. I would not be opposed to the fact that God made another planet with other people. I don't see that as being unbiblical. I'm not sure I believe it, but I don't see it crossing a biblical line.
That's exactly where I stand.
So it would have to be, and like you said, you're a literalist. You believe he did it in 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going with that idea, then it's not well, and I think there's other things, and I just can't remember at the moment, but, so I'll not talk about them. If he created everything in 7 days, he created the universe and everything in it in 7 days, including if there is other life down there as well, then they would be a young creation as well.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. God could have created another civilization yesterday.
Another universe?
No, another civilization.
Right.
Like he might have made another Earth somewhere, 50 billion light
Right, but
years
it
away
can't
from here.
be millions of years old.
But that would be what Randy is saying, because he did create the whole universe in 7 days. So if he did that, would that be then refuting the fact if he creates another life forms in some part of the universe? Because he created it all, unless we talk about birthing stars or things like that. But those already exist. I mean, that would be part of the 7 days. So I would kind of wonder if he would create a new civilization now. Help me understand that.
Well, if it's now, it's still within this 6,000 years of young Earth creation. So it's not old. It can't be older. If you're going up to 7 days in young Earth thought, then it could be younger, but it can't be older.
Okay.
So young Earth creation is the problem with evolution is, and there's a whole, I don't know if this gets into it, I'll check, but if Adam and Eve weren't the first people, but sin was here, or they were the first cause of sin when Eve ate the apple, well, we know that there was death before that, but there couldn't have been death because that's not the way God planned it. So that's one issue, but then also, does that mean, okay, is the curse just in Adam and Eve's line, or is it all humanity? Because the Bible says it's all humanity. Go back to Adam and Eve. So is there some people that are cursed and that can be saved by Christ, and other people who aren't part of that lineage that can't be saved because they're not part of that? So did Christ come from certain people? So then there is a thought that the Israelites and the Jewish people are that group of that lineage. That's a whole other thing. I believe that.
Seems to me that it's ridiculous to think that there's other places that God created whatever it means.
Well, I think what Debbie was
Other than
saying was that
angels.
it's plausible. It's not necessarily likely, but it's plausible.
One thing I saw, because wrapping head around time, like getting crazy, and we think linearly, like beginning and one direction. God's not limited by that because he created everything. He could see all of creation, all of time, all at the same time.
So, well, I guess it's unresolvable, basically.
Something
Yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't
yeah.
really affect
So we get to
your
have it.
salvation.
Logically, though, it seems that according to the word.
Another good example I've heard is Kent Ham had an example about, we have a computer. Take a computer, explain how the computer came to existence without saying a person did it. So a guy inside the computer that says, oh, I did it and did this, try to explain a computer without saying a person built it.
Well, like saying that though, when they talk about the pop can or the airplane, you find that just implies that something created it.
Like try to explain it you can only use stuff inside the computer to explain itself.
And that brings up AI now, too.
Yeah, I suppose then someone else's refute to that would be, well, what's your definition of a computer? Because if your definition of a computer is only artificial components, then of course, because by definition it's man-made, it's by definition artificial. Like you're limiting your definition to something so narrow.
And you do both, and you can have matter and all the rest of it as well. But if it wasn't created, man didn't create it, then how did it get there?
Yeah.
It's kind of like the box, and I
is
was trying to
fine-tuning
use what's
in here?
in the box to explain the box.
Yeah.
Well, if God's outside the box, right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna back up to something that you were saying because I wasn't following it. When you were saying Adam and Eve and the original sin and the lineage, can you explain that a little bit more? Because I wasn't understanding how
Yeah.
one branch would be separate from another branch if we all, with the finite cause,
Yep.
go back to Adam and Eve. So it would seem like, almost like genetics,
Yes.
that we are all of the same lineage. So I wasn't following.
So, what we believe and what we've read in the Bible is that sin entered the world, right, through Adam and Eve,
Mm-hmm.
and we're cursed since that.
Yeah.
That assumes a young earth, and it assumes that all humanity started with Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
They were our forefathers, they were beginning. If that's not the case, and we evolved over millions of years, and there's Neanderthals and all these people,
Yeah, whoever they are.
we know they died before. So death wasn't part of creation, that was from the curse
Mm-hmm.
and a sin.
I followed what you're saying.
So-
Okay, so death happens. So if you're saying we evolved, at some point Adam and Eve become, through evolution, if we're gonna follow the fact that we believe Adam and Eve were the beginning, so we're saying that death occurred over millions of years and at some time it evolved. So they're saying that a man and a woman evolved at the same time of the same age. That doesn't make sense. Just me looking
Well,
at that.
so sin and death is part of the sin. The penalty for sin is death,
Mm-hmm.
both spiritual and physical. But if that entered through Adam and Eve are only 6,000 years old with the young earth,
Mm-hmm.
these Neanderthals before that are millions of years old, well, they died and they had wars and sin, and
Mm-hmm.
then it's inconsistent with the Bible because sin didn't enter until Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
That's one inconsistency there. So when they brought in this other, we'll call it an other sin, because if they already existed, it's a different type of sin they brought in. Is only their lineage now cursed, and not the rest of the evolved creation? That's oxymoron. The rest of everything else. So if you have like all these Neanderthals,
It's impossible to have sin passed upon all things and then to have some other.
there's a common argument for theistic evolutionists is they'll say we evolved, and Adam and Eve are just two out of an existing already thousands of Neanderthals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the case when we just talk about death, and one that couldn't happen if we believe what the Bible says, but let's just go with it for devil's advocate. So then are only Adam and Eve's lineage cursed? Or is it all of them? Because they didn't do it, they were before. The Bible says Adam and Eve's lineages, the Bible assumes that Adam and Eve are the first.
Mm-hmm.
So did Christ come to forgive the sins of only that lineage, or for all the world? We know he came for all the world. Jews, Gentiles, everyone alike.
So what you said earlier in the beginning, you were talking about what has the more evidence,
Mhm.
something along those lines. And so I think that this would fit into that, which is the most logical, and according to the scriptures, what's the most logical? That Christ came and gave his life, God's own son. They planned this whole thing from before the beginning, and so the other beings that God created were angels. So if there were some other beings, why wouldn't God mention that? I mean, it seems like
Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway,
That's always an interesting comment to me, that if God created a new, like you say, time from the beginning, time to the end, he knows it all, why would he create people that are gonna have a Hitler and all of that in it and cause all this sin? Why would he do that? And we know he's coming back, and I believe soon, whether in my lifetime or not, I don't know. But why would he create something that has all of that suffering? Why would he do that?
That's a philosophical question.
the answer is that man had free choice.
But why would he even do that? Why, if he knew man was gonna have free choice, because he knew that when he created them, because he knows all things, why would he even have started the process?
Well, he wanted fellowship with man, and in order to have fellowship, we had to have the freedom to both sin, but to love. You have to have the possibility of choice. So it comes down to he gave Adam and Eve that choice, and now he's giving us the choice to receive what he did through Christ. And now there's actually more things against us believing in Christ because of the world, the flesh, and the devil. So for us to actually come to God and to receive his son is a lot more, well, I don't know if it's a lot more, but we're having, again, the same choice that Adam and Eve had, but we have Satan. That's where the dispensationalists come in. The last test is after Christ comes to rule for 1,000 years. Again, Satan is going to be loosed, and so during that 1,000 years, Adam and Eve had to deal with Satan. But during those 1,000 years, they're experiencing the wonderful rule of Christ, and yet at the end of that, when Satan is loosed, a whole bunch still follow him. So it's kind of the whole thing from Adam and Eve with Satan there, with everything perfect, to coming to when Christ rules, everything is perfect. And so whole.
And I would ask, what would be the alternative? You mean, like, would he knows there's going to be what we call evil. So would he not just create it at all, or would he not?
Yeah, that's what I
not allow evil. What would be the alternative, or what would?
The alternative would be basically, because you're talking about free choice, the alternative would be to not create anything.
Okay.
Yeah, he wanted fellowship. That's what the answer is.
Yeah, that we'd have to ask God. But if without evil, then good really has no meaning. You have to reference them to each other.
I don't know if that's true.
Well, why is it evil? Is it actually evil if you don't have something relative to compare it to?
I'm not sure I understand.
So the moral argument, you call something bad. Why is it bad?
Depending
Where are
on
you
what.
getting this moral structure? This, why is it good?
Right, but you were just saying the opposite. Something is only good unless there's like evil to make it valuable.
Oh.
I think you mean it the other way around. Something is only bad if there's a way it's supposed to be.
Well, and without God, I think that argument could go both ways without God. Because then, if there's no meaning for neither, they can say whatever they want.
Right.
But like if we're just a bunch of robots and we can't make decisions, and say
that's what you'd
we
have
did
to create
something, all these,
robots.
like all these nice things for people and charity and all this stuff, but we didn't have a choice in the matter. Well, then is that an actual? Do you appreciate that good, quote unquote, that actually they did for you? Well, they didn't have a choice in the matter, whereas now we have a choice. Are we going to do this or that? And we go outside of ourselves and sacrifice ourselves and our time and do things like Christ did for us. Right? There's an actual choice in the matter, so it carries more weight. Right? That's sort of that valuable part I'm trying to get at is. But if you didn't have a choice and you can only do good things, well then there's no choice there. There's no weight to that. It just happened. Like, where's the meaning of that come from?
But I think what Debbie was asking was, why would God create people he knew would freely reject him?
I think the part of the, going back to this idea that God wants a relationship with people that actually love him.
Exactly.
And so that's what heaven is going to be filled with, is any true Christian really has a heart of gratitude, and they worship God for all of the wonderful things that he did. So that's who's going to inhabit heaven with him for eternity. And so in order to prove that, we had to make, that's where I run into a problem, because the sovereignty of God and our choosing, no, God chose us, and so we're responding to the gospel, but it's because he's given us the faith to do that. So it gets really philosophical there.
Yeah. And this is an apologetics class, not a theology class, but I would love to do a study on the doctrine of salvation and providence and things like that. But I heard somebody's phone going off. So back to the cosmological argument. We could talk about the problem of suffering and evil. I mean, there's 3 articles in the book about that.
I think that's the next chapter, is the moral argument.
The moral argument is a little bit different from the problem of evil and suffering, but yeah, it's similar. So here's a question for you. What do you think is the biggest weakness with the cosmological argument? Like, how far does the cosmological argument take you?
Oh, that's a good question.
Well, if those 3 are what lead to the conclusion, then it's pretty simple that there must be a first cause.
Mhm.
If those are the first 3, what'd you call it,
So the syllogism.
Syllogism.
Yeah. So here, I'll write it out for you.
Wait, did I spell that wrong?
So the syllogism is the series of premises that lead to the conclusion. I forgot what I was going to say.
About what is the weakness in the cosmological argument? What would you say is the weakness?
Oh yeah. So let's say that you're having a conversation with a non-believer, and you say, well, there must be a first cause. Well, that first cause is God, right? And your unbeliever friend says, sure, it's God, but is it Buddha, or is it Jesus, or is it the flying spaghetti monster, or is it So probably I would say the biggest weakness of the cosmological argument is, sure, it shows that God created the universe, but which God?
Yeah.
Right? So it leads to just generic theism. But that's why our faith isn't just resting on the cosmological argument by itself. It's just one piece in this whole network of arguments. That's why there's 50 articles in here.
Now,
So,
where do I get that book? You have extra ones available, or?
There you go.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, yeah. So I'm on Social Security, so this is, but buying a book is getting very difficult anymore. Appreciate that.
Could you say because Buddhism didn't start until years after Adam and Eve, and Hinduism didn't start? I mean, those became in existence years later. So
Right.
that is not
right. I mean, I suppose you could look at you could deep dive into like the tenets of the beginning of the universe and all those different faith systems, because a lot of religions have a beginning to the universe. Like the universe was created by a turtle, and the world rests on his back, and there's all kinds of different creation accounts. But some, I guess you could say, well, surely it's not the one that says that the universe never began. So the point just simply says that my point is simply that the cosmological argument doesn't point specifically to Christianity. Like you can use it, the Christians use it, but Muslims use it, Buddhists use it, other faiths use it. So the cosmological argument just shows that there's a God. Doesn't say which God. But,
Right, yeah.
But that's not a problem for us, because we have other arguments like the resurrection of Jesus that show that Christianity is true.
And most all scientific and philosophical arguments and evidences for a God or creation or intelligent design are just that. They're going to point you in a direction, but they're not going to specify our God. And that's where the theology comes in about Christ.
Right.
So it'll get you in the right direction, and then you got to narrow it down to Christ. And so this book does a good job. It goes through all that, including the arguments for Christ.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'm anxious to.
Yeah, I didn't give you a handout. Would you like here's a list of all the topics in the book. So we're just choosing week to week what to read next. So we're not doing it in order. I mean, we could do it in order, but we just started with the first one, the cosmological argument, and then Debbie said she wanted to do the origin of life in the question of science by Walter Bradley. So we can study that and talk about it next time. We still do have some time.
So that you're going in this order, or?
No, we're just kind of bouncing around. The next one, the origin of life, is down in the first column, fourth one down. So I put check boxes in
next
there.
week.
So we're actually not going to meet next week because Randy and I will both be away at the men's retreat. But we will be back 2 weeks from now.
Oh, okay, that's good to know. Yeah. Okay, but then in 2 weeks you're going to do the origin of life.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I put check boxes on here so that as we go, we can just kind of mark it off, what we've done, so we can pick our next topic from there.
One of the things that I've learned in going, I've gone door to door, I've gone to the malls, and just basically I say I'm taking a survey, and I just take some topic and want their input and get the conversation going and see where they're coming from, and then going from there. But to leave them with some things that they can investigate on their own, like gotquestions.org or .com, and then the video, The Privileged Planet. You all seen that one?
I've heard about that.
It's very good.
Yeah, it's excellent. And just to see, okay, and then there's one on the nature of God, or let's see, God of Wonders is another one, and they are fantastic tools. And just say, if you're really serious in investigating, I suggest, and I'd like to get your input as to what you thought of them, and go from there. So anyway, instead of, because our little time with them, where if they will start learning to investigate, maybe God can direct them to say, and then of course on YouTube, it takes them from one thing to another. They have all these really good materials that are there. So the Holy Spirit doesn't need us to be around. He can use what's out there. And we need to avail ourselves, I think, of those things that are so readily, anybody that has a computer.
Yeah. One thing I like, one of the last session we did Defenders, we did Greg Kokel's book, Tactics.
I've got that. That's the best book I've ever used, because if you can know all of this stuff, but if you don't know how to get the conversation
Exactly.
started,
Exactly.
I was speaking to a person on one of my groups this morning, and he posted all his chat with this unbeliever, and like I said, you got to know how to enter that conversation. The goal shouldn't be just to get God out, even though that could be on the list. But
or even worse, a lot of people's goal is just to win.
Yes.
Just win a fight, win the argument. It's like, that's not.
The
not
goal
the
should
point.
be just to get somebody 1% closer to questioning, to wondering. I'm reading a book on that. 1%. You don't have to be a marathoner. You can walk to the mailbox. Just a little bit more to think about. Not necessarily to win, because you're going to turn them off.
Because a lot of people don't believe in God. A lot of people have an aversion to God and to religion. So if you just right out the gate with, wow, you're a sinner and you're going to go to hell if you don't believe in God. You lost them. You lost them. We got to speak truth
today.
but we also have to do it in love.
Yes.
So we want to get to know the person if we have the time permits. If not, we can talk to them about their beliefs, and what they believe in. Question them about it. Greg gives a good example about he's in like CVS or Walgreens,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
and there's a lady wearing a pentagram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he asks her, "Oh, what's that?" She's like,
Uh-huh.
"Oh, I'm a Wicca, the witch."
Mhm.
And he starts asking her about that, and asks her questions about it that trips her up, that are
Uh-huh.
consistent with some of her beliefs, and she's like, "Oh."
Yeah.
And it's those things like that, and he talks more about a Muslim guy at an ice cream shop that they talked to, and they built their relationship, and then finally got to get to God eventually. But
Yeah.
that wasn't the first goal.
Exactly. Yeah, and that idea of putting a rock or a pebble would be more like it.
Well, yeah, because that was from Tactics. He talks
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the rock.
I have an example from today. So this guy in one of my groups, he posted it, and he was looking for feedback and whatnot. And so he was talking to someone about plants and animals, or his animals, and they're like, "Oh, I noticed you like animals."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh yeah, I like animals. I have a love for animals." And he just kind of went this 90-degree turn to, wow. In the Bible it says people are going to worship creation and not the creator. And then just goes down the rabbit hole of God and like didn't know the person. I'm like, we want to speak truth, but there's a better way to approach that. Because the person's just like, what? I don't believe in your sky daddy. And it's like,
Uh-huh.
that's what you're going to get if
Yeah.
you might run into. It's like,
Oh yeah, I have my sister's in-laws. The whole family is a wonderful family. They're wonderful grandparents. They're wonderful husbands and wives. Very educated, doctorate degrees, master degrees, and every single one of them's an atheist. And yet they're the most wonderful people you truly could meet, but complete atheists.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
Satan's biggest tool is to get people to get as close to the truth and be good people. Makes them self-satisfied that why do I need God? I'm already doing good, and if there is a God, He's of course I'm going to be fine. That idea that man is basically good is something that I've run into more than anything, and that's where what's a guy that does all the interviews on
yeah, like that older guy out of California.
I know who you're
Yeah.
talking about. We ordered stuff from him, and I can't
Yeah.
think of his name.
and that's his biggest approach is, how are you a good person? And then he goes through the 10 Commandments and shows, have you ever committed a lust? Have you ever taken God's name in vain? And all of those. And then they have to admit that, oh, I guess you're this, and this. And so are you sure you're as good a person? And I like one thing that Charles Stanley's son, who's kind of gone off the deep end in a lot of areas, but he has one, how good is good enough? And it's one of the best ways to deal with that whole thing of being good, because okay, where does God draw the line? Is He great on a curve? And it's there's so many things that are we run into. You know, we have we got to know all these different religions. For Christians, there's a lot of work to be prepared with all. But then if you come back to the basic thing, are you a good person? In a lot of ways, I like his approach, but he has a microphone. He has things that he promises that if you'll give me this interview, I'll give you a free dinner to some place. So not all, we can't all do that kind of approach.
Some I like him. Some things he says are a bit abrasive,
Mm-hmm.
but I like he does some good stuff.
That's
Yeah.
like Ken Ham on his apologetics. When I read him, some of it he just bases his truth on the fact there is Christianity. He kind of says it's true because it's true. You know, he
Right.
doesn't always have that logical like you guys are talking about. So sometimes I don't particularly like to follow Ken Ham. I'm not trying to just
Oh,
pick
yeah,
one
no.
particular person.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm not a big Ken Pan fan. I mean, the Ark experience and the Creation Museum is super cool. Like, those things are awesome. But Ken Ham's theology and, like, the way he presents Christianity, it's like, dude, come on, man.
And he has both those books,
Yeah.
you know, so, anyway, that's my takeoff,
Yeah.
because I think what you guys are doing is more, making you think, but not saying that, all right, just, it shows there is a God. And he would say that shows there is a Christian God. Wouldn't you say that he would do that?
Yeah, I like that saying, just take the meat and spit out the bones. And that's the same way with ourselves. We have some good points, and then there's always areas that we're.
Yeah, if we throw the baby out with the bathwater, well then
Yeah, throw the baby out with the
that's not good for
bathwater.
anybody.
Yeah, so it's.
Would you say there's another weakness to the cosmological argument, or would you say that's the basic?
Well, I think for the Christian, that's the main weakness, is that it doesn't necessarily point to Yahweh. It just points to a creator, whether that's, Christian God or,
It just points to a God. It's acknowledging that there is a God.
That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good argument. It just means that for a Christian, that shouldn't be your only defense. Like, it's just a piece in the whole network of our faith.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my sister, and she was saying, well, why is your God different than the person that believes that they should just watch out for any living form, or that the worm is as important as we are? I mean, she believes in multiple religions and multiple gods, I suppose is the way to say it. It got pretty intense, so we didn't finish the conversation, but she was very upset at the fact that we would say there's this God when other people genuinely believe there is this God. So, like you're saying, it leads to a God, but whose God is it?
Right. Well, and that's where you would, appeal to other arguments like the resurrection of Jesus for the truth of Christianity.
Okay.
I only bring that up because it's something to be mindful of. When you're having a conversation with somebody and you make an appeal to the cosmological argument, and they say, "Well, that doesn't prove that Jesus is God. It just says that there is a God." It's like, well, yeah, you're right. Let's talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I got into apologetics not because I was having a conversation with my friend, and he asked, I couldn't answer one of the questions, but this apologetics and the material I read, this book was one of the first books I ever read, really bolstered my faith.
Yeah, that's
So
good.
not only does it bolster our faith, it's also a talking point if we talk to the people to explain our faith, but it also helps us with ours as well, if we have any doubts and whatnot, so.
Yeah, and the word tells us we're supposed to be ready to give an answer. There's many other verses beside that one, but that's the one that's the easiest to apply.
And that's one thing I think the church has not done a great job of is equipping
Yes.
the saints and all of us to be prepared to give a reason for what we believe. It tells us we're to do that.
Yeah.
The younger generation, as they go off to college, we're losing them.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And parents need to be equipped to equip their kids. Of course, and then if you get into the end times, this is why the end times are here, is because lukewarmness and all of that. And so when you understand the word, it all fits. So it's just God kind of, he doesn't give us any specific date, but there are certain characteristics of this age that are sure. And Israel being in the land is to me one of the biggest keys, that's never before in history been where they're back in their land. They're not Christians at all, but they're at least identifiable people now again. So anyway, to stimulate each other and iron sharpens iron.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm looking at. And you guys, we all have things to make us think more. Yeah.
So are there any other questions or comments on the cosmological argument?
I understand it more than when I read it. when I read it, it made no sense at all.
That's totally okay. That's totally okay. No shame in that.
I think, Carl Sagan,
Mm.
him and other scientists, they believe, back in the day, not anymore, that the universe was and always is. It's just always been around. And then they discovered redshift in the light of stars, and the universe is expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so they prove themselves wrong, and they go,
Yeah.
oh, there's a beginning. And then believers of all faiths have been saying that from the very beginning. There's creation. And so now that's just another piece that helps that. So then now we know there was a starting point, and we can look back at evolution. This argument can be applied to, or this talking point to evolution. Okay, sure. What if we did evolve? Devil's advocate. Let's go back to the very beginning, to the very first cell. How did it?
The funny thing I think about evolution is if somebody tries to make an appeal to evolution as like evidence against God, I would say that if evolution is true, that only serves to prove that God is more likely to exist, because God, if someone says, well, evolution is true, then that's evidence against God, they're making the supposition that God is limited by time and resources. Like, oh, God doesn't have enough time to use evolution.
That's what I was gonna say. I mean, if you go back in time to that point of beginning, which they do mathematically, there isn't enough time for evolution to have evolved.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Yeah.
There's a good article in one of my books I read. Well, there's a bunch of them. One particular I think of when you mentioned that is the genes for mutations. So they took an ape and they were able to identify the genes that are used in the skull.
Mm-hmm.
So from our skull to their skull, there's not just one gene, there's a bunch of genes, because you have the bones and the muscles, the nerves, all the tissue, everything else that's in there. So it's not just one gene mutating at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They all have to mutate at the same time.
Like the eye argument.
Yeah. But then you have, okay, well, they observed gene mutations over time. Now that they're observing different mutations, you have the second issue. Okay, was it guided or unguided? If it's unguided, how's the chances that all of those at the same time can mutate to exactly what you need?
Right, which is why I
That's the
say if
second
evolution is true, that just serves as evidence that God exists, because it had to be guided.
Yep. And then you have the third problem is, okay, well, the time we've taken to observe mutations for one gene, the time it would take just for this one example, the skulls to change would take more time than what they say exists already, not to mention the whole animal, and then everything else subsequently behind it from the single cell. There's not enough time. Their own science proves them wrong, but then what happened? We have fossils. But the fossils date the layers, and layers date the fossils, and then they have you can go on and on. But it's interesting.
And then the simple part of it is, okay, so not only did man evolve, they had to have a woman to evolve at the same time, male and female. How did they become able to reproduce? Because you'd have to have both of them.
Yeah. So if you go back to the very beginning, if we're doing the causality argument, okay, if evolution did happen. Okay, we'll go back to the very first few cells. Well, what does it take to build a cell? And you can get to that argument, all the proteins, amino acids, and the chances for that. And, okay, well, but then you have the building blocks for those. Where do those come from? And then how do they get put together?
Right, how do they
just
get into that
way?
configuration?
And then how do they become alive?
Lightning struck.
Because we, now, in our century, we have clean labs, absolutely clean. We have all the elements, all the things available to us, and we're guided, we're intelligent, but we have no idea. We can't put it together, can't do it. It's possible.
Yeah.
But it just happened by itself in a dirty environment in the middle of nowhere, just
Yeah.
unguided and
I'd like to bring it home is the reason that you want to believe in evolution is because most evolutionists admit that because then they're not accountable to God. And that it helps to get them to really have to deal with the real issue.
I think that's true for more learned people who understand those topics, but I think younger generations, I know like me myself, that's and I thought evolution was possible, and there's certainly microevolution, but
Yeah, micro is.
on a
And
big
that's what you
picture,
have to say, we're talking about macro or micro, because we do believe in microevolution.
It depends on your definition of evolution, because if you're just saying
Yeah.
change, well, yeah, change
Yeah.
is obvious.
Defining terms is really important a lot of times, so it's, that's what Dennis Prager, if you ever listen to his idea that I'd rather have clarity than.
he's big on rationality. I have a rational faith. So he actually
Yeah.
wrote
Yeah, that's his whole.
the Rational Bible is his
Ah.
commentary version of the Bible.
Yeah,
He's like, I have a rational God, I have a rational faith.
yeah, which to a certain extent is very good in his art. I mean, when I listen to him, he does a better job of defending the Christian faith than most Christians do. And he keeps coming, his basis of thinking is biblical, so that's why he comes across with so much good common sense, is the way I take him.
One thing with Dennis Prager and other like the other
Wait,
guy, the
Craig?
Daily Wire,
Jordan Peterson.
him, and well, I think he's Christian now, but
Yeah, I think he's a closet Christian.
the other guy, Ben Shapiro, they're so smart and they have a belief in God and they're so intelligent. It's like, did you guys read the New Testament? Did you research it at all? I mean, you guys I would think would get it. I don't understand, but each to their own, I suppose. It just boggles me. I just can't fathom that you're so smart and you believe in God. You don't believe in Christ.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird. But
Yeah.
that's a side note.
And I like to just ask people if they believe in it, when's the last time you've been to the zoo? And just to help them to process this, and you look at the hippopotamus, you look at all the variety of birds, you look at the chimpanzees, you look at the elephant, the camel, the peacock, and really that all just evolves from one cell, and that people that aren't into all the technology, they have to come up with a.
Well, and even now scientists are going, because that thought that we all evolved from single cells, they still believe in evolution, but now it's not a single tree of life where we all came from one and branched off. Now they believe that's not plausible just with what they found. Now there has to be separate trees of life that we
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. That I mean, that would be the logical thing, because when you see the vast variety, yeah, that all came from one cell. It's just.
But even that has its own set of problems too.
So they're believing in more than one spontaneous life form
Right.
coming about, is what you're saying.
Well, and it gets really convoluted. And
Yeah,
but
evolution is
these-
one of the worst theories there ever is.
yeah, they don't really, from what I've read, they don't go too deep after that for the multiple trees. They just say it's one tree's not, from what we found, it doesn't match up. But even then, the multiple trees can't work. They don't have if it were truly unguided, you would have all these species and fossils of other in between. Like right now as it sits, we don't have links between all these.
Mm-hmm.
They have other animals that are similar, but traits of this one and this one, and they have like one or two between that they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
They can't actually link.
That's gonna
Yeah,
kinda
they
go
don't
into
have
our
the
origin of
fossils.
life.
Yeah, I was gonna
next.
say, man, we're just segueing right into the origin of life.
Mhm.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We are running short on time though, so we will not be here next week because Randy and I will be out. So we have 2 weeks to read the origin of life. I'll try to have that scanned and ready for reading today or tomorrow.
Okay,
But I'll send out an email with a link to it as soon as it's ready.
okay.
Would anybody like to close this in a word of prayer, or should I?
Randy.
Randy.
I guess I'll close this in a word of prayer.
Okay.
Father, you are amazing. Your creation just stuns us, Lord. And
for that, Lord. We love you with all of our hearts and all of our souls and all of our minds. Father, I just pray that your Holy Spirit would be with us this week, and that you would open the eyes of our hearts as we look into the origin of life. And Father, I pray that you would just open doors for us to have the opportunity to speak your truth into those who don't yet know you. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. And tell me,